Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our remote learning from survival to exceptional. And this webinar is going to be focused on well-being in isolation and remote instruction. I would like to introduce to you Brandy Schumann from the SMU Counseling. She will be discussing the topic and giving us advice. I wanted to let everybody know that at the bottom there is a Q&A button that you can press. If you have questions during this presentation, go ahead and click on that Q&A and submit questions at any point in time, and Brandy will filter as many as possible. So welcome, Brandy, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Christina, and welcome everybody. I'm, I guess, hoping and fearful that is going to feel a little different than some of your other webinars that you've attended. I'm a pretty interactive teacher, and I like interaction, and this is set up as a webinar, and so some of the things that I plan to do with y'all today require a little bit more interaction. So I'm going to lean heavily on that Q&A chat sort of version space so that I can kind of gain from you all where you're at. It is a little awkward, I will say, to be talking just to myself, though my kids will say I do it all the time. I'm sitting here before you as a fellow faculty member. I taught for the counseling program for well over a decade now. I have a private practice on the square where I serve the community. I'm a mother of three, so right now I'm a preschool, elementary, and middle school teacher, while also working full-time and pretending to be the principal and the chef and everything else. And so I will say my skill set has been called upon quite frequently recently, and been asked to give the tips and the helpful hints and advice on how to cope at this time. And I've just kind of rolling with it. A lot of this is in my wheelhouse, and I haven't had to do much preparation, but I will tell you, when I got the email after agreeing, oh yeah, will you do something for the for SMU on this, and I got the title that it is survival to exceptional, all of a sudden I felt pressure that here I am helping people be okay with being in survival mode, and then all of a sudden this wave of pressure to be beyond surviving but to actually be exceptional. And so I got to observe my own behavior in that perception of pressure. And so, I'm aware that I'm curious as to your own feelings about registering for education on how to be exceptional right now. And what does that mean at a time where everything is altered? We all know that goals and expectations and ideals all have to be adjusted when the landscape changes. But where is the permission, the learning curve permission, and all of that? So I also thought it was very ironic that we were doing a wellness presentation over the lunch hour, because I could argue that those people who didn't register for a wellness presentation over the lunch hour might be practicing a bit more engaged wellness than maybe we are. There's a counterintuitive sort of experience going on in that sense. And I'm also a little bit curious about whether or not I've been charged to kind of teach you something or some things that you already know. My guess is that you already know 101 things that are good for you, that are healthy for you, that you should be doing. And that maybe what we're doing a little bit is Albert Ellis, who's a theorist in the counseling field, talks about how we should all over ourselves. We should, and that we are inviting this opportunity to basically judge ourselves and feel guilty for what we're not doing, and thus working against our own productivity, our own wellness, our own functioning. And so what I'd like to do to have our first sort of experiential activity is everybody, and I see that there are 18 of us here together right now. I'd like you to use the Q&A to just list some of those things you know that are healthy for you. Some that are popping in my mind are drinking more water, standing up at least once every hour to leave the screen and get blood going through your body. Exercise, I see, came in. Thank you, May. What else? Keep going. Getting enough sleep. And I would say even that, I'm sure we've all heard about regular sleeping patterns, going to sleep at the same time and waking up at the same time. A lot of times you can know your sleep cycles off just by waking up in the middle of a dream, something you would have slept through if you were able to complete a full sleep cycle and we're keeping it regular. Yoga, meditation, eating healthy, time alone. Yes, so many good things. Keep them coming. I'm going to, while you guys have those come up, I see diet, lots of fruits and vegetables. Yes, work boundaries, having a clear beginning and end to your work day. Harder when you have a 4-year-old coming in and out. Walking, eating better, getting more rest, checking. Look at all these things we already know to do. I'm going to share a screen with you. I gave this same question to my students, and this was, I used a whiteboard on Zoom, and these are all the wonderful things they already know to do. And you can see a lot of those same ones that you guys did and that you guys came up with. So I think it's interesting that we know all this, know all of these things to do, but we're not doing them. So what is it that's getting in the way of it? I'm going to stop sharing this real quick. And I want to share with you a TikTok video that my daughter shared with me, and I just thought it was fantastic. This artist basically created a song out of all the posts that were on COVID, what people were doing and what their experience of the pandemic was. Let me share that one with you. So as she sings, you're going to see all the different suggestions, just like you guys came up with, populating on the screen. And so if you're not able to hear clearly her lyrics, you can look at those text boxes to see what she's singing.
Running, baking, reading, cleaning, eating, sleeping, dancing, streaming, cooking, painting, meditating, singing, drawing, gardening, playing PUBG, watching movies, surfing, YouTube, sharing memes, getting depressed, crying, doing puzzles, painting, Tiger King. Remember friends, they were fun, but now you're gone. More time, less motivation. I can't remember the last time I went out. Why is everyone obsessed with Animal Crossing right now? I've been staying up till 3 a.m. and sleeping until noon. I dressed up just to sit in my living room. I miss my friends, yeah, and toilet paper. Overpriced coffee, go to get a burger. Gonna kiss my mom and hug someone the second that this thing is done. Cause I miss my friends, yeah, and toilet paper.
And it ends abruptly because TikTok only allows so much time, but she's got a second part of the version if you've got a TikTok account. But I really just like that, you know, she's just listing all the different things that people know to do, but kind of what's getting in the way of doing that. So let's use the Q&A section again, and let's give it a number this time. Let's say 10. A 10 is, I know what to do, I'm just not doing it, but I've got the knowledge and I can recognize the things that I'm doing or not doing. And then down here at a 1, I'd say, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure what to do. And so if everybody will just go ahead and enter in a number in that Q&A, let's see like where everyone's landing. See some 8s. A lot of 8s. There's a big consensus around that. We've got about a 7. So the knowledge is there. So it's what is getting in the way of that, okay? Let's use, ask S's to share. Looks like maybe we're asking, is everybody able to see the Q&A section? I'm not sure. Faye or Ian, if that question goes to you guys. But what I'd like you to do now is list the things that you know you shouldn't be doing in that same Q&A box. What gets in the way? What is harming our functioning? What's getting in the way of our wellness? What are the things you shouldn't be doing? I'll tell you one that I know I've engaged with mistakenly a couple times is panic scrolling, where I get on a rabbit hole of something that is somewhat informative but worrisome. Yeah, Bruce is joining me in that worry. What else? What is getting in the way? What things aren't healthy? Negative thinking and watching the news, media exposure, lack of exercise, feeling the need to react and respond immediately. Yes, it's much easier to be reactive than to think through something and then respond cognitively. Obsessing with little tasks, letting stress take over, knowing but not doing, right? Constant bombardment of negative data and interaction. So we know all of this and it's happening. And I think one of the things that we are failing to do is be patient with the fact that we are having a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Say that again, a normal reaction to an abnormal event rather than an abnormal reaction to a normal event. And so there's something very universal in how everybody's kind of having to rediscover how to engage in coping mechanisms. There's a kind of a practice that we do in counseling that you never take away something without replacing it with something else. So let's say somebody is utilizing alcohol to cope with stress and maybe even developing abusive type habits, becoming an alcoholic. We wouldn't expect that person to be able to function just by pulling the alcohol away because the alcohol was a coping mechanism. So we would want to look at, is there a support system in place? What other experiences or tools or behaviors can we engage that person in to replace that alcohol? And what's kind of happened in our society is we have taken away a lot of people's coping mechanisms without putting anything else in place, okay? So it's a period of rediscovery, like what does work? What actually satisfies the same things that I used to do? And is it possible to kind of to find those same sorts of coping mechanisms in this new time where we have different restrictions? Maybe we're restricted more to digital interaction, or you know, how do we connect? Well, we have to have our face covered. Albert Mehrabian in the 1960s did a bunch of studies around looking at how communication gets from adult A to adult B. And what they found was that the amount of communication that's in words alone is, and we're looking at like text messages here, when you get an email, the amount of communication that gets from person A, adult A to adult B is only 7%. Now we've all had this experience where like we've mistaken a text, or we're like wondering like, why is that person yelling at me when they're using all caps? Or we've done these like really creative things. We use emojis all over our text messages just to try to create more emotion and more delivery of the words, of the expression. But sometimes we'll just find that not to be satisfying. Like we want to hear that person's voice. We want to hear their tone, inflection, spacing, sarcasm. And so sometimes we'll, you know, this is getting confusing. I feel like we're getting off. There's miscommunication here. So we'll call that person just so we can hear that voice. And sometimes we know that person on the phone so well, we can even tell what they are doing non-verbally. I know when I talk to my mother, I can tell even when I'm on the phone with her, if she's twirling her hair. She has a habit of that. And I can tell when she's distracted, and I know she's watching the TV or something like that, because I've been around her enough to see those paired interactions. But when we look at tone, spacing, inflection, sarcasm, 38% of communication is through tone, spacing, all of those characteristics that go along with voice. So even when we have the words, even when we can connect digitally or on the phone, we're needing something else, and that's that non-verbally. Now, right now, I'm not getting communication from you all except through words. You're getting a little bit more of my nonverbal, but you're not getting the lower half of my body. Sometimes we focus a lot here on facial expressions and shoulders and things like that, but maybe you've even seen with your students that we're not sure what's happening down here. Are they typing something different? Are they feeling tense? Are they, I know when I'm in session with a client, I can tell if they're like locking their legs behind the chair, or if their hands are going like this. It's much harder for you to tell that I'm picking my nails if all you can see is my face. Our whole body non-verbally, 55% of our communication is through nonverbal communication. So we're at a time where we have a lot of people who cope through connection, who cope through touch, who cope through interaction, and we're having to redesign those types of coping mechanisms right now. And sometimes the lack of, we take away the alcohol from an alcoholic without putting something else there, it's going to, impact motivation. So in some senses, I think if we can give ourselves, less ideas about what we should do and advice on what we should or shouldn't do, it becomes more about permission to cope however we need to cope right now, permission to see that if we binge watched a show and we stayed up way too late because that's what felt good in the moment and that's what helps us get through that, acknowledge that as coping, not as failing to keep a regular sleep schedule. So now I'm feeling guilty because now I feel like I fed into me not coping well, and then now I'm the next day dealing with that guilt. Can we see that we are experimenting? Can we see that we're learning that maybe that feels good sometimes? Maybe that's needed to escape or to cope with that moment, that show can take us out of our reality and give us a little bit of an escape, and that we have to be careful about putting on pressure or judging ourselves, or the pressure to become exceptional by someone else's definition. It's very interesting. We have, in some senses, closed our doors, right? We all kind of came inside and had to block out. I saw with clients that an appreciation for the lack of peer pressure and to dress a certain way and to have their hair a certain way or have certain possessions, like a lot of those negative pressures have disappeared. The Joneses and keeping up with the Joneses, they have disappeared temporarily. But then all of a sudden, I see them creeping back in a different way of, oh, well, this is what my children are doing with online learning. This is what I'm doing with my students. And how do we keep up with these examples and do it all, and now have to do it all at the same time while holding all of these different roles? It's something that's just unachievable. So then we're experiencing failure more often, and failure and hopelessness it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It kind of feeds into itself and you can kind of spiral down. So that lack of acceptance or that lack of tolerance of needing to find what works for you is almost being criticized. What's popping in my head is in the counseling field, when you graduate, you have to take our state exam. It's called the National Counselor Exam. And I'm the internship director. So I have all of the students at the end of the program, and every single term from nearly every student, I get, how do you study for the exam? How do you study for the exam? And my response to them is always, well, how do you typically study for your exam? What I like to do when I have a big exam is I like to get all of the preparation materials that I can possibly get my hands on. I will buy the biggest book, the biggest program, and I like to put it in my bag and like carry it around with me for like 3 months, hoping that like osmosis will kind of set in and I'll just absorb all that knowledge. And I like to just stress about it for a long time and have it like distract me and weighing over me. And then about 1 week till the big exam, I like start to freak out and I like cram study, and I disrupt my sleeping patterns and my eating patterns. And I finally am able to block everything else out and just hyper focus on that. And I cram it all in and I stress, and then I take the test and I realize it wasn't as big of a deal as I was making it out to be. So that's how at least my life patterns have shown me I like to study. And I found that my approach to that test was no different. Your approach to figuring out how to cope with COVID is going to be very, very similar to your past approaches to figuring out what to do. There is no magical answer. You guys already know all the things that I would teach you. I mean, they all came up in the Q&A section. You know which things to avoid, but it becomes looking at your own patterns and what is getting in the way for you, and how much of that judgment is external and the shoulds, I should, I must, versus, permission and honoring that sometimes staying up late is a coping mechanism. Sometimes eating that ice cream is a coping mechanism. Now there's a crossover between when we do something too much and it impairs our functioning, meaning not being able to regulate, not being able to function with the coping mechanisms that we're using. And definitely that's kind of a generic sort of measure that I help people decide whether or not it might be time to help or to seek out additional assistance, a mental health professional or a support group, something like that. but everybody is struggling. That's a normal thing happening right now. And so if I can offer anything today, it's a little bit, I hope to offer is acceptance and permission to see even your own struggles as what's supposed to be going on right now. In fact, I think in some senses be very concerned if we weren't struggling, if we didn't somehow react to the absence of contact and disruption to schedule. What does it mean about the relationships we have in our life if that pulling them away doesn't disrupt us? And it's similar to if I have a child who's lost a parent, and the surviving parent is worried about their child's functioning. Of course we're worried. Of course we want to offer support. Of course we want to do some things recognizing that there's a loss. But if the child didn't struggle, didn't respond to the loss of a parent, I would be wondering what kind of relationship did they have in the first place that the child's life wasn't disrupted by that loss. So I really hope that we can be a little bit more kind to ourselves and honor our own individual journeys. I know in my field, and it's going to be different for each one, is to recognize how can we be creative. Religion, the arts, our approach to all of these things that provided support needs to be relooked at in through the screen of what is needed for safety. I'll give you an example. These are some masks that my daughter and I were making at home as in anticipation of my office needing to come back to potentially be doing some face-to-face work in the next few weeks, month or so. And this mask, that has a clear front, allows obviously people to see my face. It allows them to see my smile. I've worn it out a few times. I've made a cloth one as well. And the reaction that I've gotten from individuals out is much different than when I wear a fully covered mask. So I'm aware of how approachable people see me as, or how much they want to interact with me, how they respond. I've had people go, oh, I can see your mouth. I can see your smile. I'm hard of hearing. I read lips. Like just needing to look at the safety requirements are out there. We have to operate within this margin, but there is room to redesign what we can do. I think this webinar is a good example. I know I've been to a couple webinars where there's not any interaction, and I can kind of give myself permission to disengage, do some emails on the side, do some chat. Can we even engage in the Q&A more often to where we feel like we are looking at it anew rather than just who had the time to kind of approach those things before. So those are some of the things that I wanted to pass on today for sure, but I'd also like to open it up to some questions. I'm wondering what brought you here to this section when you already knew what to do and what not to do. What was your motivation? What were you hoping to get out of this sectional? If anybody wants to put some things up there, I'm going to be keeping my eye on that for sure. Learning new things, yeah. And what's funny is I'm not gonna lie, I searched what are tips to help people cope, and I mean everything I found I already knew, much like I see you guys putting up here. And there are a lot of different things that you guys can find on your own, and you guys already found those things, but I see a couple new ones coming in. Staying present with your friends and your family, especially with your kids, and connection as much as new ideas. Yeah, I think the relationship and connection is really tough. I saw people talking, or somebody mentioned earlier, like the defining work versus home, my ability to turn on or turn off, and even switch modes based on what their needs are versus what my needs are. I think one of the biggest things that I've honored and recognized is I am apologizing a heck of a lot more than I did before. And that was one of the things I always taught, learning how to recover a relationship when you damage it. And I would joke that I apologize to my kids daily. Well, now it's happening like multiple times a day. And going back to it and saying, you know, yesterday when I yelled, I didn't mean to, I was just tired and frustrated. And sometimes when everything's changing, we're going to say things that we don't mean. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but recognizing that if I'm getting to that point, what happened in my day to contribute to it? I do feel a little funny being an SMU speaker, and of course, you know, wanting to help encourage the productivity and for SMU in general, but I've also experienced my program, the Simmons School and SMU as a whole as wanting, even just offering this webinar, wanting to encourage functioning, like the health of all of us. And so sometimes helping your higher ups recognize where you're at and what you're capable of. I know in our department, different people at different times have had to say, myself included, like, I can't take any more on this week. With this going on at home, I'm needing to back off of this. Can somebody step up and do this piece? And we have quite a bit of that support kind of coming in and out, where when I have a little bit more to give, I offer it, like this, like here. And when I don't, there's an honoring and a recognition that that's needed. And so if I can do that for other people, that's the start of me being able to do that for myself, like recognizing what are my limits. I also think it's super important, you know, I see a lot of family sort of boundary kind of things coming in, is looking at not so much what is the answer right now, but if we jump forward 10 years from now, you know, what do we want this time? What do we want to have learned from this time? What do I want my kids to have experienced during this time? What do I want my family members, my partner to experience at the time? What is the most important part of my work that I want to make sure I take care of, and which things can I recognize that are not as much of a priority? I think when we fast forward 10 years, it makes it much more clear what we should be doing now. So if we're saying that I want my child to recognize that they were important and that there's a work-life balance even in times of chaos, and I wanted my students to walk away with, you know, key concepts in depth, but recognize that they're not going to be able to absorb as much right now because they're in the same struggle that we're in. I think those are important pieces to help us glean what's accurate to what we should be focusing on right now, and which things we need to let go, that we cannot do it all, that it is absolutely impossible to do all of the things that we were doing before and take on double the load especially without a learning curve. Okay, I see some questions coming in. How to connect with students in online teaching, and what is reasonable to set up as time boundaries when teaching in this online environment. So one of the things that I'm seeing with my students is the repetition in questions. So where I always have some students who don't attend to information the first time, and I'll do more boundary setting where this was available to you here, you might remember this, I'd like you to go reference this, and then if you still have questions, come back. I've tried to be more patient with the fact that I'm having trouble sometimes coming up with a word or saying the wrong words at the wrong time because I've got so much kind of going on. So if I'm seeing a shift in my ability to retain or regurgitate information, then I can also recognize that they're going to be struggling with some of those same things. And so I've tried to be more patient, and I've done more hand-holding and a little bit more reminding than I typically would. I have had students like you all have had where they maybe their weddings are postponed, they've lost their employment, they have a family member who's been diagnosed, or I had a student miss her final because she was experiencing COVID-like symptoms. She didn't end up having COVID, but at the same time, the fear that was associated with those symptoms. So I think flexibility and understanding is what's needed right now. We are not going to be able to tease out some of the people who may be abusing or taking advantage of some of those leniencies, but I don't know if that's necessarily the priority. I think when we recognize and we can see that, you know, the practice or the fact that we're drawn towards wellness we're needing more of it ourselves, it begs the question that we need to be providing some of that for our students as well. How do we cope with the unknown? Oh my goodness. I just had a staff meeting this morning and was helping some of my staff cope with that same thing, and especially with the information that's out there and the knowing what to believe and knowing what to trust. And I could guarantee that in our 22 participants in this room, that we all have a different variation of beliefs, what we think is safe, what we think is not, what we think is accurate news versus fake news, which entities we trust and we look to for information, and it just, there isn't a universal answer. And I think some of that is what, there's actually been some studies looking at, when there is an unclear, when there's a lack of information clarity, then it creates chaos. They did a study, I don't remember, sorry, poor presentation skills on my part here, but there was a study that looked at an airport, 2 flights that were delayed, and one that had, they just delayed the individuals. They said, I'm sorry, this flight's been delayed. It didn't give them any other information, just basically said, you've been delayed. And then they filmed the nonverbals and the behaviors of the folks that were in the gate area. And then on a second gate, they said, oh, sorry, the plane's been delayed. There's a safety issue. It's going to be at least 30 minutes. We have a safety technician on board. And in 30 minutes, we'll give you an update, and then film those people's behaviors. And common sense, right? The people with more information, who had predictability, who had information that was consistent and only one sort of message being sent, made a lot of reduction in distress. You didn't see such agitation. Nonverbal behaviors were calm. You didn't have as many people walking up to the counter to ask additional questions. In the other section, there was a lot of chaos, people coming up trying to get more information even though there was no more available. And I think some of that's what's going on here. I will tell you, I had a very humbling experience lately. There was a video that went out that was really, really well done, that was in some senses, a lot of senses, opposite of my own value system, but it was really, really well done. And I had a little bit of a wake up moment of, wow, had I been raised differently, had I been surrounded by these messages, this is what I would believe. And I was reminded that Galileo was jailed because he believed the world was round, and it was common belief that it was flat. And that just one edition of our DSM, our book that we diagnose, all diagnoses are listed, had homosexuality listed as a disease, as a disorder. Excuse me, not a disease, but a disorder, just as recent as its last edition. And so we can be very in touch with what we believe, and then we can find out that everything that we know is false down the road. And so I think recognizing, at least what this video did for me, is it made me a little bit less righteous in my position. It made me a little bit more tolerant of the behaviors that I see that are different than my own. And especially, and there's a lot of charged interactions. I'm sure you all are seeing it out and about in our community about whether or not to open or to stay closed, and to what safety measures versus a return to kind of our functioning before. How do we kind of navigate all of that? So I don't necessarily have an idea or an answer of do this, but I think that recognition of that universal experience that's going on, and that we are a member of that society. There are things that that will bring you peace. And one thing that my father said to me when I was fearful of him dying, I remember saying, Dad, what if you die? What if you die? And he's my number one support. He was my everything in my parenting experience growing up. And he couldn't promise me that it's going to be okay. There wasn't a known of when he's going to die or when he's not going to die, that sort of thing. But what he said to me was, I don't plan on going anywhere for a long time. So that satisfied me in terms of, okay, I'm connected with this person, and this person is seeing it similar to mine, and we're going to do our best efforts to, like, he's not going to text and drive, and we do things like fire planning, and granted some of this was from when I was younger, the fire planning, things like that, to help us feel like we are taking care of ourselves. So we can create that for our family members. We know what that means for ourselves. If it's paying attention to what information is coming in and when are we escalating ourselves versus de-escalating ourselves. What are some strategies to re-enter the non-digital world? Okay, so I'm seeing myself and my staff on a roller coaster. So one day I am feeling much more comfortable, and another day I'm feeling much more hesitant. Sometimes that has to do with the news intake. Sometimes it has to do with the person I'm interacting with. If I experience someone else being more careful, I notice that impacts my reaction to them. If I approach somebody more cautiously, I notice they are more careful. I had an experience in my home the other day. I run a different part of my practice business. I also sell punching bags. And so it's a home business, and I have employees that kind of tackle all that for me. But they are here, two of them, and I told them that they're going to need to wear masks, and they were wearing masks. And because I had multiple people in my home, me and my kids had masks inside our house, just because it was right when things were starting to shift, and I wasn't sure where I sat with it. And I happened to have, I didn't know they were coming. My husband had set it up, 2 painters to come in and finish up some detail work that got put on hold as everything escalated. And I didn't know they were coming in that day, but they came up to the door without masks. And I'm opening the door with a mask. But what I noticed was I had this moment of, okay, do I ask them to wear a mask? Okay, I'm going to ask them to wear a mask. And as they went to go get their supplies, and I went to go get 2 masks that I had to give them to them, they showed back up at the door with masks on already. So they interacted with me and thus changed their behavior. And the same is going to happen the other way. But I think some of the things that we need to spend some time on is, what is our comfort level? What is our individual plan? Where do our boundaries lie? And then try to communicate that ahead of time, helping people understand, practicing how do you ask somebody? How do you set boundaries? I've noticed that some people that, like my father, who typically lives with us, we had him go stay at the lake. He has a lake house, and just to kind of protect him from my husband, who's a first responder. And he was less eager to stay away and less concerned about his boundaries than I was. The idea that my husband or through us could potentially expose him was very threatening to me. And I've noticed, as what we've done is we've relaxed and we've started to go see him every weekend, because when I went to go see him, his house was in disarray. I saw his decline in functioning. And to me, that started to worry me more than the potential risk of COVID, because it was so concrete, it was happening. And so we started coming to visit, but we're not embracing. But it's not because he's not trying to embrace. Like, I'll say, hi, Dad, and he'll come in to give me a kiss, and I'm like, whoa. And so how to, again, address some of the needs that we're seeing to re-engage, to connect. I'm wanting to give him that embrace just as much as he's wanting to give it to me, but helping him understand that it is uncomfortable for me to know that we're risking him, but it was more uncomfortable to stay away that long and to that extreme. And so I think the communication piece becomes necessary. So then we're having to communicate through sometimes digital or the virtual means, but we're needing to do that on ahead of time sometimes, so that we're not having to decide things and figure things out in the moment. Because in the moment, whatever you used to do, that's habit, and that will feel more natural, and it will kind of automatically engage. And then you're going to have like this kind of awkward, and then boom, it's already happened. So having some of those discussions, or even figuring out where people are. And I'll say, these interactions are a lot like sex. When 2 people are having sex, in order for it to be consensual, it has to go with the most conservative person's position. Otherwise, it's non-consensual. So if this person's not as comfortable doing that thing, then you don't do it. Otherwise, it's not consensual. So as you're looking at this interaction, see, it all relates back to sex. When you're looking at a new interaction, whatever is the most conservative position, that's the one that the relationship is going to have to conform to. Otherwise, you're going to have somebody not feeling comfortable in it. So it is a time for us to kind of look at which relationships are the most important, which ones are worth risk to us, maybe which ones we recognize were maybe more draining or not. I'm going to say something horrible here. I recognize, like, we had some family members that we don't get along with so great, kind of hinting to the idea of getting together, I was like, no way, it's COVID. And then I'm realizing that I'm kind of initiating, well, who could my kids spend their birthday with? And so there's some hypocrisy in what is safe versus not safe. And it's tied into how important are those relationships, or how do I prioritize what is going to be achieved by that moment. So similar to the one with my dad. Okay, I see another one here by David. Ideas on how to keep home work balance when work is at home, and balancing new work demands with personal demands like kids at home, finding groceries, and constantly convincing my elderly parents not to go. Oh my gosh, so much so. I have those same things going on. I think it's recognizing that we can't do it all. I'm a hyper achiever. I feel super empowered and better when I can produce. And so I kind of came in like, okay, let's put these clinics through on telehealth. I started picking up a lot with my department so that I could feel really good, and I could see like my kids' functionings declined, or how confusing it was for them to be here and not have access to me. And realizing that what I was kind of doing to take care of me had me neglecting different areas, that when those falter, I don't feel solid anymore. And then I have to even compensate more by doing those things that are kind of like Band-Aids to help me compensate. So some of it is taking a look at that 10 years forward and looking back, what are the priorities that are most important to me now. So I think if we have a real honest conversation about ourselves, it's easier to set those boundaries. There's also an activity that I do with clients all the time, and this might be helpful to y'all. It's an Adlerian activity, and you put yes and no on a piece of paper, okay? And there's something to concretizing it and writing it out. But if I say yes to taking on this other class, what am I saying no to? I'm saying no to being able to spend more time with the kids right now. I'm saying no to be able to exhale and have some downtime to be able to recoup. Sometimes when we write it down, because we can, gosh, us high achieving people here in academia world, we can justify and rationalize all kinds of good opportunities. And I constantly hear things like, oh, an opportunity knocks, you got to open that door. I find that opportunity knocks a heck of a lot of times, and you got to be a little bit more selective about which ones you open, because if you open one that you really weren't too excited about, it takes the spot of something that you are really passionate about. So concretizing it, writing, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? Sometimes seeing that helps us go, okay, whoa. It's different than a pro-con list, but it helps us decide that I'm not okay saying no to that. And sometimes reversing it too, putting that same thing, okay, if I say no to this, then I can say yes to that. How does it feel? And no judgment either way. I've been in situations where I need to neglect my family short-term in order to be able to be free to more engage long-term. So giving yourself permission to recognize like what is the best answer for you right now, and the answer this week might be different than next week. Let's see. I'm sorry, a lot is not wise. What's your initial take on that? I think there's a difference between going, I'm sorry, like just doing it and not recognizing what was a harm to relationship. I think it's super important for our kids to, or with anybody, to recognize that when we damage our relationship or damage a relationship, it's our responsibility to recover it. Now, I have seen some things in the business world that we'll talk about, like saying I'm sorry is owning something that maybe you shouldn't own, and it can shift the sense of like legal responsibility and things like that. That's not so much what I'm talking about. And there's a difference between a genuine apology and I'm sorry that you're upset. That we've all received in genuine apologies. But so much of what we're hoping, gosh, when we interact with kids or we interact with other people, when we bring forth our pain and struggles, to feel understood and recognize that that was distressful. Now, I can clarify, like, I'm so sorry that I said that. I didn't mean to say that. That was not my intent. My intent was to communicate this, and I could hear it coming out wrong as I said it. So it doesn't mean I want to undermine what I was going through. It doesn't mean I don't want to undermine my intent or my need, but I can recognize that it maybe was delivered poorly or that it was perceived different than my intent. And that is something I can communicate. I also can be aware of like, what has it touched in me? And Christine, I see you coming back on. I'd probably, oh, I see a couple minutes over.
You have been so great. You have been awesome, and very insightful, even for just things that I reflect on my own life. So thank you so much. And I hate cutting you off because I can sit and listen to you forever. I do want to let everybody know that this video will be available wherever you registered. That link we'll have a link there for you to be able to watch this video again. But Brandy, do you mind just kind of wrapping up and just in like 30 seconds, just
Sure.
give us what we want to leave with as far as thoughts that you would recommend?
And I see a lot of other questions coming through too. So, my email is bschumann@smu.edu, BSCHUMANN. Feel free to reach out. I see there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of resources out there to match. So I think permission and acceptance of self, be a little bit more forgiving of ourselves and the people who are making mistakes in the environment. And I'd say, if you really are struggling, there's resources out there. Don't be afraid to reach out. We don't have to do this alone. And we don't have to be someone else's idea of exceptional.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the attendees for coming. And again, this will be available wherever you registered. There'll be a link there to watch the video. Thank you for your time. Take care.